Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, I wanted to talk about Master 1, and more specifically, climbing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. Now, as someone who has gotten to Master 1 every season, as well as gotten to the highest rank within every season, even when it wasn't Master 1, minus I think 2 seasons, where things got busy. I wanted to give what I have kind of noticed helps with climbing, helps with getting to higher ranks and stuff like that. Now, there are technically rewards for doing better. Okay, so obviously getting to master and climbing the ranks gives you lots of gems. So if that's why you're doing this, here are some tips and tricks. If you just want to get there because, hey, maybe one season you really enjoy the meta, you want to get to the highest rank, or you just want the prowess of being like, yeah, I did that, then here are some tips, okay? Starting off with the very first one, which I'm just going to hop right back into my match history, which is you gotta play a lot of games. This is the biggest thing, but genuinely, this is going to be the number one thing. You have to play lots of games. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game of variance. If you are able to play more games, you are going to be more likely to win enough to climb. You don't even necessarily have to have a 50% win rate. As long as you get lucky enough, if you've played enough games, you can climb, right? Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel kind of has a weird system where it's not based on specifically like an MMR system, where, you know, winning gives you a certain amount of matchmaking rating or anything like that. It is solely based on, can you get enough wins in a row? So, for example, I could go, you know, win 1, lose 2, win 1, lose 2, win 1, lose 2, and then just win 4 in a row, and that'll put me over the edge to get me into Master Tier here. That's just going to be the case across the board in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. However, it's much easier to climb in the lower ranks because you don't D-rank. So from Platinum and below, don't really need to worry about playing a maximum amount of games. Focus more on specifically just winning games, which is pretty easy. You don't really need to worry about that much. But yeah, it is just kind of like a numbers game oftentimes. Okay, the second thing I want to make note of is note how long each season is. It is a month. Note when it stops, note when it starts, yada yada. But an important thing to remember is the fact that not everyone is going to be climbing throughout that entire time. Oftentimes, you will get more resistance in climbs very early on, where a lot of people are trying to get right back to their previous ranks, right back to Master 1, etc. And 2, at the end of the season, when a lot of people are kind of finishing out their climbs, finishing out how much they want to do. So if you can kind of do your climb in the middle of the season, in the middle of the month, that's going to do the best for you. You're going to have the most efficiency, you're going to do the best, etc., etc. Make sense? Makes sense. Now, let's talk about decks, which I would imagine most people are going to talk the most about. When it comes to climbing, when it comes to, you know, choosing how to best play the game, most people are going to talk to you about what deck you should pick. Now, I even do tier lists about what decks are going to be the best for climbing, but here's the thing. I have a lot of decks. I am not nearly as good at some of these decks as I am others. For example, I'm not very good at Branded. So, for me, trying to climb with Branded, even though it is a good deck with which you can climb, it's not going to be a good idea, right? However, I would not necessarily suggest climbing with something like Tri-Brigade, right? It's significantly weaker, but I notably am much better at Tri-Brigade or something along those lines, so for me, it makes more sense for me to try and play more Tri-Brigade. I just know the ins and outs, I'm much better with it, I enjoy the games a lot more, which we'll talk about later, and just overall, yeah, Tri-Brigade is very, very good for me. So for me, it's going to be easier to climb with something I'm familiar with. And this leads me right into my second point, which is play what you enjoy. This is genuinely, I think, the number one tip I can give you. All of the other stuff thus far doesn't really matter. Not that big of a deal. However, if you genuinely enjoy a deck, like for example, I love playing Sprite. Okay? So because of that, a lot of my games are way more enjoyable for me, which means I'm more focused, I'm more engaged, and on top of that, I'm less likely to get upset and to tilt. So I'm more likely to just do better, right? Because I'm more focused. I'm more aware of what I can and cannot do, right? And so while I'm not that great at Sprite, like I'm decent at it, but it's less so that I'm good at Sprite and more so that I enjoy it, and so I tend to perform better. Again, similar to a lot of other things. Similar to why I'm good at Tier or why I'm good at Unchained or something like that, right? A lot of it has to do with the simple fact that I enjoy the decks. So, don't look at a tier list and go, hey, you know what the best deck is right now? That's right, it's Snake Eyes. I'm going to play Snake Eyes. If you don't enjoy playing a deck like this, don't play it. If you're not having fun, don't play the game. It's that simple. This is a game. This is a game. It's great if you are enjoying this deck. If you're like, yeah, I thoroughly enjoy doing the Snake Eye combo every time, and being able to have that consistency, and being able to do these like really cool end boards and work out these different deck building philosophies and ideas and stuff like that, great. Not everyone's going to do that. Not everyone's going to enjoy that. If you instead enjoy playing something like Horus, for example, I don't have just like pure Horus deck. If you enjoy playing Pearly, which plays very differently, if you enjoy playing this or that or the other thing, you can absolutely do that. And it's entirely up to you what you find enjoyable, right? And with that being said, that does matter way more than basically anything else. Because if you're just like upset and you're like, I'm just going to do this to get the gems, I'm just going to do this to get the what have you, you're going to have a terrible time. You're going to regret doing it. You're not going to have a lick of motivation, and you're just going to be like, I just want to get out of here. So choose a deck or even multiple decks that you enjoy and stick with those. Okay. And then the last thing, as we're talking about decks, you are going to do a lot better if you're just playing a singular deck, right? Because you're going to be able to modify that deck list individually and be like, hey, I've noticed people are main decking these cards, right? It's like, okay, people are playing Nibiru. Maybe I'll play around to the Nibiru and, more heavily, like, make my end boards to kind of meet that. Or maybe people are playing Gamma, so I'll, maybe potentially bait out Gammas or something like that. Yada yada, right? And you can more easily solidify an idea of how you want to build and play your deck if you are very not focused, if you have a basic understanding as to your own deck, as well as a more in-depth understanding in it, is going to help more and more. That sounded really weird. Basically, stick to 1 to 2 decks if you can. Obviously, this is pretty self-explanatory when it comes to any game. The more you get comfortable with a specific idea, a specific character, a specific deck, etc., you're going to do better and better. But notably, don't feel like you need to switch decks because it's not going well, but also don't feel like you need to stick with the same build. For example, this 42 card list that I have right here is not necessarily something that I would stick to the entire time. It's something I built immediately, but if I were to actually play Yubel and I found out, hey, 1-for-1, just not needed, I could cut that, boom, 41 cards, it's a little bit more consistent, yada yada. Or I could be like, okay, triple tack, no one's really playing into it, it's not very useful, either going first or going second or something along those lines, maybe I'll cut that card. I wouldn't, I like those cards, but there you go. And kind of leading into that, something of note is playing your own favorite cards. For example, I just mentioned Triple Tactics, right? Triple Tactics Talents, great card, fantastic, really useful, but not everyone is playing it, right? I thoroughly love this card. I think that it is a fantastic card, and I play it in basically every single one of my decks because I find it very useful, both going first and going second. I find it to be a useful addition to basically every single one of my decks and my strategies, but if you don't find it very useful, if you find it to be more of a hindrance than a help, you can absolutely cut cards like this. Don't look at other people's decks and go, hey, I see why you're playing that card. Or don't look at other people's decks and go, I don't know why you're playing these cards, but I'm just going to copy that deck card for card. Think of your own, like, hey, I want to play this card instead, right? Obviously, with some exceptions, Maxi, Ash Blossom, stuff like that, pretty self-explanatory. You kind of need these basically all the time. But if there are other options, right, I think that Gamma is very, very valuable. Not everyone does, so I play Gamma in a lot of my builds where most other people don't. Same thing with Triple Tack, same thing with Nibiru. I've seen a lot of people, specifically on the ladder, cutting things like Nibiru. Don't do that. It's very, very useful. Play the Nibiru. So tons of stuff like that that are overall just very useful information. Yeah, just if you have a card that you enjoy using and that you find to be useful, use it, right? Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, let's talk about deck building in particular. And the reason I have SnowiKs pulled up is because of the way that it specifically deck builds, which is very different than a lot of other decks. So, first things first, you gotta know what your deck is aiming to do. For example, in something more pure Snake Eyes, the idea is very similar to that of Sprite, where it is, hey, I have a very consistent engine that makes a very good end board due to things like extra deck monsters or main deck bricks. Or not even necessarily bricks, just like main deck cards, right? So with the Snake Eye end board, right, you oftentimes have like a Flomberg on your field and stuff like that. You don't necessarily want to draw, but for the most part, you want that hyper consistency, so you play 40 cards exactly. 40 cards is the most consistent. It's going to give you the easiest access to all of your engine, and it's going to give you also the easiest time at seeing your best cards. Now, when do you go above 40? This is why I have SnowiKs. You can always go above 40, but it does sacrifice consistency. So, if your deck doesn't necessarily need more consistency, or your deck more or less is already super consistent, like for example, something like SnowiKs, you can go above 40, right? A great example of this is Branded, that can play 50 to 60, and in fact is better playing 50 to 60. But SnowiKs, I think, is very interesting. You definitely don't want to go that high in the amount of cards in your deck, right? Reason being, if you go that high, it's going to be diluted with a whole bunch of cards you don't actually need. But you still want to play over 40 because you don't want to draw the cards that you are setting off of Turbulence. Things like Contain and Extinguish, you just genuinely do not want to draw ever, right? Then you can also play other bricks like, other like cards that you can search that are better if you're searching them. Things like Subversion, things like Rescue, things like Alert, where it's like, these can still be useful. They're still something that you could draw and do well with having drawn them, but overall, you're still not wanting to necessarily see them, right? It's better if you see this card or that card or something like that, right? Heck, even Turbulence is like this. You don't necessarily want to see Turbulence in your opening hand, but it's not necessarily a dead card if you do see it, right? So because of stuff like that, you're wanting to play more cards, so you're diluting the amount of cards that are just like not good draws with things that could potentially be more useful. Normally what you're putting in here as additional cards are going to be things like hand traps, things like non-engine, things to kind of help you in that regard, right? So in this 45 card list here, I have lots of hand traps, you know, many a hand trap, many a non-engine. And then on top of that, I'm also playing a lot of engine to help me with that. I'm playing the Bonfire, I'm playing the Poplar, I'm playing Hydrant and Triple Emergency and all of that stuff. But then we're still like, we still have a bunch of bricks in here that we don't necessarily want to see. So it's trying to find that balance. SnowiKs happens to have one of the more difficult challenges with this, so there's that. But for the most part, if your deck is something that needs to see very specific cards, for example, Vanquish Soul, they need to see Raisin, play 40 cards. You play 40 on the dot, no more, no less. Obviously, you can't play less. But you play the 40 because if you played more, you're not going to see the card you absolutely need to see. It's the same thing with like Kashtira right now, etc. Same thing with Sprite as well. Hey, you really need to see the Sprite cards. The big thing is the fact that you can do the combo every time. So being able to do that every turn is very valuable, but you do need to see those cards to get your combo started. Similarly, Tearlament kind of falls into this category. Not always. You can go over 40 if you're playing an additional engine like Horus, but if you're just playing Tear, again, 40 cards at the minimum. You need to hit those mills. You need to hit the cards that you need to see consistently, and that is kind of the idea, right? So if you can dilute your deck with something to maybe, you know, not draw some dead cards, you can absolutely do that. But for the most part, try and stick to 40. Try and keep it concise and simple so that you're drawing your best cards every time. Okay, I've moved my camera over here because right now we're currently in solo mode, and I wanted to tell you about the 3 buttons right down here, which are very, very valuable. And this is going to be more of like in the in-gameplay section. So, first things first, get comfortable with the UI. It's a pretty good UI. In fact, it's like fantastic, especially in comparison to other TCG simulators and stuff like that. Very, very useful. First things first, I'm actually going to start over here with the extra deck. You can always click on it, see how many extra deck cards your opponent has, see how many you have. Easy peasy, great. You can also check Banish and Grave just by clicking on them. I think everyone pretty much knows this. Pretty simple, pretty nice. You can click on anything as well, and it'll bring it up right. Click on it, it's right there. You can also zoom in by clicking on the icon. You can click card info, which I believe just makes it a little bit easier to read, if I'm not mistaken. So like if I click this, and I don't know what the card info button does. It's weird. But you can also click related cards, which will tell you everything. Like it will bring up all of the other cards that it can like interact with. So for example, right, if I go Tri-Brigade Fractal and I click related cards, cool, it shows me Nerval and Kit, 2 of the cards that would be sent off of something like a Tri-Brigade Fractal. Great, now I know this and I can read these cards, yada yada. Great, great. However, you can also click your own deck and your opponent's deck, see how many cards that are playing, yada yada. However, right down here, we have a button, which you can turn on in the settings, which I believe is dual? Yes. So, activation confirmation, you can change it here to, I have it on switch and hold, which allows me to do a few things, which I'll explain in a second. You can do auto, don't do this. If you really want to play the game, don't do this. It's just a straight up disadvantage. It means you can't chain to your own stuff nearly as effectively, and a lot of stuff like that. You can do hold 1, which just allows you to hold using different, you know, hold requirements, basically. I don't enjoy that as much. You could do switch. This is absolutely what I would recommend. Reason being, it allows you to change whether you are chaining to on or off or auto or what have you. Most of the time I just have it on auto, it's just easiest, but oftentimes I will change it to on so that I have the ability to chain it to every interaction. Every time priority would normally pass to me, I can do that. And priority, very quickly, is just when, like, you have the opportunity to potentially do something. Doesn't mean you have to do something. It just means if my opponent takes an action, whatever that action may be, priority would pass back to me to see if I want to do something. That will always happen, unless you don't have something chainable in this game, but, like, in the TCG, or in paper, the priority would always pass to the next person. So, for example, if I were to set a card here, my priority set after I set the card would immediately pass to the opponent. They could immediately interact if they had something. So, for example, they could, you know, I set a card, they could go, I'm going to activate Dimension Shifter here, right? Or, you know, if I set a card, they could go, cool, I'm going to MST as soon as you set that card. Right? Stuff like that. So that's what on is. Auto is just the standard, like, hey, you can chain if another thing pops up. Great. Off means you're not chaining. Unless, like, I think there are a few situations where it does prompt you to chain. I don't know the exacts on, like, when it prompts you to chain something. I think it's when, like, an activation condition is met, as opposed to when you could just, like, chain something. So, for example, if I were to Fractal, I believe Ash would pop up here. It doesn't. I lied. So that's the difference. I think it's just, like... I honestly couldn't tell you. But yeah, here we go. You know, activating Kit, all of this stuff. But then I chain it to on, and... Nerval, here, out comes Ash. This would also work on the other button. On auto as well. So there's that. Okay? Cool. So that's very useful. I like mine having it on switch and hold. What did I just do? Okay. Which now allows me, as you can see, I'm just clicking down the mouse button. There it is. Clicking it down, holding it down. And it's now on, and now it's on auto. No longer holding the button. Bada bing, bada boom. Okay? Makes sense? So, if I click the button, it's now on, which means if I were to click that, like in draw phase and I had something activatable, like for example, I don't know, the Max C or Dimension Shifter or something along those lines, bada bing, bada boom, I can immediately interact, right? So you could just click that, turn it on, instead of having to go down here and click the button. Cool, cool. That's all great and useful. However, there's another button right next to it that's just as useful. There's a little I button that tells you all of the information about the field, right? How many cards your opponent has in hand, how many cards in their deck, how many cards in their extra deck, cards in grave, cards in the banish zone. But most importantly, I can't really show it because I have to hold the button here. Most notably is the little damage calculator, right? So that little sword over to the left and to the right for my opponent. That tells you how much damage is on field, and more specifically, how much damage is currently in attack position. It's kind of weird. So it's not actually how much damage you could potentially take, but how much damage is currently face up in attack position. So for example, if I have a Zeus on the field, that's it. That's sideways, right? Actually, I can literally just show you. So right now, I have 0. Right, we see I have 0. If I put this guy in attack position, bada bing, bada boom, I now have 1200 attack. So there you go. That useful information for you there. Okay, so I've kind of started playing a little bit just to give you an idea of how like that number changes. So as you can see here, I've got 7,300 attack points now on my field. We're currently in the middle of a chain. Don't worry about that. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, I now have 73 because I have 24, 3,000, and then 19 on my field. That's 73 altogether. My opponent has 2,400, and it's all because they are in attack position. If I summon something in defense, it doesn't calculate it, which is kind of interesting. I didn't have anything in defense position that actually had attack points, so oops. But there you go. The second thing of note is right below that sword, there's that little icon that looks kind of like a normal summon. That's how many normal summons the person has, right? So because it's my turn, my opponent has 0 normal summons. And then there's that little special summon icon next to it, which also indicates how many, whether or not an opponent or anyone can special summon. So for example, if my opponent normal summons like a Flunder monster, that little icon will have a little like ban symbol next to it, like a can't do this. So that will tell you whether or not they can special summon, right? You oftentimes see it pop up when your opponent like normal summons a Pachycephalo or something along those lines, which then locks everyone out of special summoning. So there's that. Okay, next thing, very important, which I make a mistake on all of the time, is setting chains and setting them correctly. So I have a very interesting chain that I need to do here. I need to go chainlink. Well, I don't need to do anything, but I need Bear Brum to get the search after I get a search with Nerval, because Bear Brum is going to search out a trap and then have to put a card back from the deck. So if it searches the trap, it's just going to put the trap right back into the bottom of the deck. However, Nerval is triggering in the same chain, which means if Nerval resolves, it has the ability to search out a card and just add it to my hand, which means if I have a card in my hand and then Bear Brum's effect resolves, it adds the card, and then we can put the card we searched off of Nerval back into the bottom of the deck. So, very useful. Now, we don't want to lose to potentially Ash Blossom or some sort of other negate like that, so because of that, we are going to chain as Chainlink 3 the Shureg, which means Shureg will go first as Chainlink 3, Chainlink 2 will be Nerval, and then Chainlink 1 will be Bear Brum. So we do this in the reverse order. So we're going to go Bear Brum as Chainlink 1, then we will go Nerval as Chainlink 2, and then as Chainlink 3, we will go for the Shureg. So Shureg's effect will activate. We will be able to banish non-targeting in order to just remove a card from the field. I'll remove the back row. Don't really need to deal with the front row. We're going to search a card. Doesn't really matter what we're searching here because we're immediately going to put it back with the Bear Brum effect here. So we're going to search out the Nerval, and now I have to put a card back into the bottom of the deck. We're going to put the Kit. Boom. Bada bing, bada boom. We're done. So there's that. And now, obviously, we can calculate here how much damage we're going to do. We're going to deal 59, I believe, damage. So they'll be left on 21. So we'll just walk into the field, and we'll go from there. Yay. Hooray! So there you go. Oh, 31. Sorry. I'm bad at math. We were dealing 49. I'm just bad at math. I'm sorry. Actually, I don't know how I got numbers. Don't worry about it. Anyway, but here you can see right over here, you can see my graveyard, you can see the banish zone, very useful. Now, let's talk about the last button right over here, which is the log, which is very useful, because it tells you basically everything. However, what it doesn't do, does kind of relate to triple tack, so we'll just hover over this. It doesn't allow you to, like, keep information that you have already seen. So, for example, if you activate Kashtira Unicorn, your opponent ashes it, okay? You don't get the search. Great. You then look at your opponent's extra deck, and you steal a card from it, banishing it face down. Cool. Here's the thing. If you do that, you do not get a chance to look at it again from the log. So, for example, right, if I were to go do that whole thing, or if I were to go, like, triple tack, look at my opponent's hand, right, I have to just remember or write it down or do something along those lines, because the game will not keep that information, because it is hidden information. You have to remember it. That is not public knowledge. It's not knowledge to you. It is only knowledge to the opponent, right? So you cannot look at it. While you can obviously look at your own extra deck whenever you want, you cannot look at your opponent's extra deck, nor your opponent's hand whenever, right? And you can't ask for, like, what cards they had, right? Keep that in mind for paper Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. If your opponent goes, hey, what cards do I know about? You don't have to tell them. You can, and it's nice, especially at, like, locals where it doesn't really matter. It's fine. It's not that big of a deal. But, yeah, you don't have to tell them. But yeah, there you go. That's some useful information. You get to look at the opponent's hand, but then you can't, like, go back. So make sure you know what those cards are. I do this all the time. I go too fast. I don't look at the actual hand, and then I make a mistake forgetting about a card that they had that I absolutely could have played around, and that's a goof on my part. So keep that in mind. That is something of note. Coolio. Also, this is something I literally just noticed. This log over here tells you whose turn it was at what point. So, for example, all of this blue, this is my turn. All of the red is my opponent's turn. And then all of the blue is, once again, my turn. So that's pretty interesting. Alright, last thing, it's very simple. The tiers are kind of backwards from most other games. You go from the bottom, which is 5, to the top, which is 1. So, obviously, getting to Master 1 is more valuable than getting to Master 5, even though 5 is a bigger number, and it would make more sense, right? And Duel Links, I believe, is the other way. So if you've played Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, it's the opposite, where you go from 1 to, I believe, 7, in most cases. So there's that. But that's basically it. That's all that I have to tell you. I don't think there's anything that I have left out in terms of just general tips. Obviously, there are deck tips and stuff like that, that I, you know, as someone who plays a bunch of different decks, I may be able to help with, but for the most part, that's basically it. Hopefully this helped you out, and hopefully your climb goes better than mine. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.